Think fast. That's what this entire discussion, this entire week's content is all about thinking fast and slow, as it turns out. Today, and in this module, this week's course content, we're talking about the phenomenon of priming. And so you can see here, I've got a meme from the dredges of the internet. Quickly name three things that aren't Jackie Chan. Obviously, it's going to be difficult because he's pictured on this meme's image. Priming is all about attention. It's all about automaticity. It's all about repetition. And in today's module and in the readings for this week, we're going to be talking about what all of those things mean and more. But I really want to encapsulate or kick off really your study of priming by giving you a quote from Herbert Simon from 1995 that really, I think, speaks to the big picture here of what we're thinking about. And in this quote, Simon writes, "Information consumes the attention of its recipients. Hence, a wealth of information creates a poverty of attention, and a need to allocate that attention efficiently among the overabundance of information sources that might consume it." And if you think about that quote, if you pause the slide and really kind of mull over it, you may be struck by how Herbert Simon, writing this in 1995, is really kind of previewing some big trends in the way that we process information. This is more than 25 years ago, and I think that his comments are more true now than they were at the time, with the hyperabundance of information on the internet, on all sorts of different channels of information that we can consume. And the big takeaway here, again, this going back to this central idea that information consumes the attention of its recipients, is in a way kind of thinking about this relationship backwards from the way that we might normally. You might think that, we as consumers consume the information, but Herbert Simon's making the point that information consumes us, which I think that's an idea that has massive implications for the way that we think about our daily lives. I mean, I think constantly about the way that information consumes me as somebody who is constantly trying to learn as much as possible about politics today and about the scholarship of the disciplines. It's a very difficult thing to navigate in today's day and age. And I challenge you, as you think about this phenomenon of priming today, what are the sorts of information that you consume that are worth consuming? Because, of course, as we hear from Simon, information also is consuming us when we consume it. And so what I think I mean by that is especially this idea that a lot of the time our brains, by virtue of their limitations, are not perceiving everything in our surroundings. We have brains that are incredibly powerful, incredibly capable processors, but we can't process everything. If you think about it, our world is so unbelievably crowded with audiovisual stimuli that if we were to attend to, that is, pay attention to, every single thing in our environment, we would immediately be unable to focus on anything. So I have here, consider, what are all the noises you can hear right now in your environment in addition to my voice? Well, I hear the whirring of my processors and the recording devices and things in my computer. And, maybe faintly I can hear the sound of radiators ticking, keeping the house warm. And maybe somewhere the cat is stalking about. But of course, especially a thing like the hum of a computer, that's not something that I'm aware of every second that it's happening. I tell the story frequently of a time when my wife and I went to a nice restaurant downtown in Baltimore, and unfortunately we got there and there was this horrible shrill noise that was affecting the restaurant because a fire alarm was going off in the building next door. But of course it was a shared wall. And so it wasn't super loud, but it was very much audible and kind of annoying, this kind of constant ringing sound of the fire alarm. And we sat down and we said, okay, well, we have reservations. This is a nice place. We want to have a nice date night and it's fine. We'll just deal with this noise. And as it turned out, halfway through our meal, the fire alarm had turned off. And yet, amazingly, neither of us actually recognized that it had gone off until it had been off for quite some time. And we realized suddenly both of us sat up with a start and we looked at each other and said, wait a minute, the sound's gone. And lo and behold, it was. And no one had actually noticed that it had gone off. And that's because the sound had been so continuous, so monotonous in our heads that we actually tuned it out completely. And so that is really, again, a testament to the power of automaticity in our minds. We are selective in our attention. We respond to things, stimuli that come into our heads that are new. But in general, we're swamped. We're always swamped in terms of the stuff that's coming into our heads at any given time. We're being bombarded at all times by stimuli, colors and sounds and lights and motion. And that's evolutionary. There's a good reason why we are selective in what we attend to or what we pay attention to. It's because we need to be on our toes at all times, because there could be existential threats lurking around the corner at any time. And so this desire of our brain to go into like ignore mode of all kinds of different information, I think has some important consequences for the way that we process news. And by that, I mean that we can tune out a lot of these stimuli. And that means that when information comes to us, we're not always chewing on every detail of it. We're not always effortfully processing everything that we hear. And so when we watch the news, when we even read the news, when, especially in an audio-visual context, when we get the news over the internet or on social media, we are not consuming every piece of that effortfully. Otherwise, again, our cognitive resources would be so quickly depleted, we'd become extremely tired, and we would immediately be like, oh, I can't keep doing this. Our attention spans would be tapped out, and we'd have to, turn away from whatever it is that we're trying to study. I mean, anybody who's ever tried to read like a lengthy textbook chapter all in one go, and then find themselves later, 20 seconds later on their phone, knows that our attention spans are limited, in some cases very limited. And again, that's, I think, a natural part of the way that our brains work. Maybe a difficult one for the perspective of a student who's trying to get their work done, but an inevitable consequence of automaticity and the desire in our minds to preserve cognitive resources. So Lodge and Tabor, which I want you to carefully read for this week, I think this is a very important piece. They introduced this idea called the John Q. Public, or the JQP model. And really, I think that this insight is central to our understanding of everything we'll talk about for the second half of this course, because they're talking about an idea of dual process cognition that unlocks a lot of important insights about the way that Americans learn from and respond to political news. And so essentially, John Q. Public is this framework for a person who's encountering political news or political information. And this person, this fictitious John Q. Public, is somebody who takes a lot of mental shortcuts when consuming information, because again, it's very effortful. And so John Q. Public is sometimes on a track in a cognitive framework in which they use affect or emotion as a guide, and they process information with snap judgments using automaticity. So they'll react with affect, with a feeling to a certain kind of political news story, and they will do so without a lot of consideration about what's actually happening. They do it automatically. And so there's a subconscious element here. They're subconsciously reacting without really thinking about what's going on. Other times, John Q. Public is perfectly capable of deliberating over the information they're receiving and really sitting down and engaging in this effortful process of understanding what they're hearing. But most of the time, Lodge and Tabor would argue, this automatic process, this affective or emotional process, is the one that's happening more often. And so that's a really important insight that I think we can't forget for the rest of the semester, because, again, we're starting to move in the course, especially after spring break, into a mode where we're thinking more about how citizens receive this information. And so if our first observation into the mind of a citizen is that they're often relying on snap judgments to process their exposure to the news, that has a lot of ramifications that we'll talk about and develop in later modules. And I think the other piece of this that the John Q. Public model brings to us that's of importance for today's discussion, or for this week's discussion, is the idea of hot cognition. And so hot cognition, it sounds, a little bit like a bad band name or something from the 90s. Hot cognition is an important concept, and that is the idea that our exposure to political stimuli over time can cause feelings to become glued together to basic political ideas. Meaning that when those political ideas are invoked in the future, we feel something. We feel an emotional response to that thing that may not even really be grounded in any rational kind of feeling, right? We hear a thing and we become upset, or we become inspired, or we become angry, or become fearful whenever a politician or whenever the news invokes that specific idea element. And so political speech is capable of invoking these incredibly intense feelings, this horrible, potentially, terror-stricken, response in our hearts when we hear even mundane things, maybe even pithy things, or just simple catchphrases or simple ideas. So this is a very important concept in political science, and one that has been written about a tremendous amount, certainly much more than just the 3 pieces that we're going to be reading for this week's material. Its ramifications are endless, and we'll be talking a lot more about hot cognition and how Americans are reacting to political news today, and campaigns and politicians especially, in later weeks. So really, I think, take a close look at that Lodge and Tabor piece. I think it's got a lot in there about the psychology of Americans today that unlocks, as I said, a lot of understanding about the second half of the course. But of course, today's topic, the thing that we want to think about for this week, is a specific media effect. It's actually not really this week, even though we're thinking about models of how people process and receive information, we're actually not thinking about individuals at all still. We're thinking about priming as a media effect phenomenon. We'll talk much more about that in our class meeting this week. But Otati et al., this piece in psychology, is, I think, a good piece in terms of its summary of various forms of priming effects that we can encounter out there in the wild. And so I wonder if you could think about especially this idea of issue primes. So issue primes are essentially repetition that focuses on specific political issues that causes people to invoke those and remember them more easily than other considerations. We know, for example, I think a really important example of one of these is economic primes. So we know that when people start talking about specific features of the economy, a lot of Americans remember that. And so the next time that kind of thing comes up, then Americans are much quicker to make political judgments on the basis of those very, oft repeated and well understood economic sort of trends. And so basically, economy primes can make us engage in retrospective voting, essentially. A basic voting principle where we see the economy. If the economy is doing poorly, we have a knee-jerk reaction where we try to vote against incumbents. And so that's been fairly well established empirically over a lot of time in American politics, is that when presidents preside over really weak economies, then they tend to lose. And maybe that's unfair. Maybe that's not truly fair to those presidents who don't really have like a big button on their desk that says make the economy better or not. But nevertheless, we do it, and partially because of the way that news primes you to think about the economy. But there's a lot of other issue primes we can think about, and of course many recent examples that I think would be interesting comparisons. And so I ask you, as you do this reading, to really think about the genres of primes out there that Otati et al. Talk about. And I want to think about, whatever those primes we might think about that we may have encountered in the recent past, can we detect those? Because again, one of the biggest principles of this week's content is that priming is generally a pretty subliminal phenomenon. And so it's something that is happening, and Americans are generally not aware that it's happening. But of course, we in this class, we're sophisticated, students of politics and of media. I want to know, have you been able to detect efforts to prime by politicians and candidates? And especially, what do those primes look like to you when you're able to catch them in the act of doing it? I think it's an interesting question, and if you can't think of any, I think it's important to go back to this article and try to see more examples in the reading, so that you're able to get a better sense of what priming is and maybe what it isn't. Got another meme here of Captain America here, right? Captain America is finally figuring out who's ruining his life, and it turns out that it's him, right? And so he uses an expletive here. that I have helpfully blocked out from view. But I want to just talk briefly about this Lewandowski article from 2018. It's a great article. This is really a high quality piece of empirical political science research. Again, the caveat here is that there's tables and figures and methods that, probably it's not great to expose yourself to that stuff if you don't have a good understanding of it, because it may melt down your brain. Don't worry about it, right? Just focus on the theory development, the first kind of half of the article, and then look at the conclusions, I think, and you'll get the big picture of what Lewandowski is talking about. This article is about the possibility that priming people's sense of American patriotism, getting people to think about the fact that we're all Americans, essentially, could help us reduce affective and nasty forms of political polarization where Republicans and Democrats are at each other's throats all the time. Maybe we can tone down the kind of partisan rancor and the partisan nastiness in our society by helpfully priming people to remember that we're all Americans, hence the Captain America meme. And so I think this is an interesting test as well, because a lot of the literature on priming makes the assumption that priming tends to mess with people's brains in ways that maybe aren't great for democracy. Remember, returning back to that fundamental question of how does the media environment, how does everything we've been talking about inform the quality of democracy? And Lewandowski comes along with this kind of counter argument that says, look, priming if executed in a way that's designed to get people to come together over their disagreements, that could actually be a good thing. And so I think this, again, is a very interesting article, kind of a fun one that really gets into some of the ways that primes can be powerful. And again, we think about committed, staunch Democrats and committed, staunch Republicans, and the way that they think about one another in today's day and age is extraordinarily negative. And so to have those effects be mitigated by a simple prime, by a simple reminder like this, a simple nudge, essentially, is a really powerful finding, and one that I think speaks volumes to the power of framing as well. If you go back to the Otadi et al. Article at the very beginning of that piece, they talk about this minimal effects model, which essentially the minimal effects model was a model of media effects that we had for many, many years in communication studies and in political science, where we essentially assumed we can't detect any major effects from media on citizens' attention, on citizens' attitudes. So it simply must not exist. The media must not really have much of an effect on the way that people think and feel about politics. And I think a lot of scholars were like, okay, maybe we just haven't been able to measure it properly yet. And so with the advent of agenda setting from last week, research on agenda setting, and the ability of media sources to decide what we're talking about, and then now this subliminal kind of priming messaging story, and later we'll talk about framing as well, the third of these three media effects, that minimal effects model started to go away. And so now I think we're in a position in the literature where we're starting to say, look, this is real stuff. Media effects matter. Agenda setting, as we've seen, matters a lot. Priming also, I think, is very powerful, and increasingly we're coming to recognize the power of priming. And so Lewandowski's article is a great example of just how powerful priming can be in a way that mitigates some of the most bitter, most rancorous elements of political disagreement in our society. So maybe it's a good thing as well if we can do it right. As you're reading this, there's just a few questions that I think you should consider, in addition to those that I've already posed. One is, again, to go back and think carefully about, even though priming is supposed to be subliminal, can I identify priming effects in my own information environment? Have I seen this out there? Is this something that is real in my own life? And in addition to that, thinking about examples of priming that we might be able to come up with, I also want to compare concepts. I want to think about the concept of agenda setting from last week and the concept of priming from this week, and see if maybe there's some overlap here, because that is definitely a critique that has come in recent years about these media effects models, is that maybe these two things are the same thing. So maybe agenda setting is just like big priming, or priming at some sort of large or macro scale. Maybe think back to Boydston and some of the ways that she characterizes agenda setting. Think to these psychological models and ask yourself, how can we distinguish or square or fit these two concepts together? Are these the same concepts? Are they concepts that inform each other, or are they completely distinct and separate? And then finally, I want to think about the so what of priming, because I think that's one of the other big issues with the literature today is that we tend to focus so much on the micro level of people's brains being influenced by priming. We don't think about the macro consequences for the big picture of how priming might be influencing people on a mass scale. And so, especially, I want to think about journalists and the way that they might fulfill their roles as communicators, and whether they may be purposefully engaging in priming or whether they may be unintentionally priming audiences with certain behaviors. Can we think about certain news values and how they might engage in priming without actually trying to? And then also, what about politicians and incumbents and candidates alike? Do we think that they are trying to engage in priming, or are they doing it unintentionally? And how can we tell when a prime is something that's intentional, when a prime is something that's unintentional, when a prime is powerful, or when a prime is weak? How do we know that a prime is happening in today's day and age? So I leave you with those questions. I hope that this has given you a lot to chew on. And again, get ready to go inside the minds of the American public this week as we consider for the first time the idea that automatic processing, hot cognition, the John Q. Public model could be a powerful way to understand how these messages are actually received by average people. All right, I'll see you during our next class discussion.